Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this DSA webinar. Where has COP26 left us in relation to key issues around the climate emergency? A warm welcome to everyone. My name is Emily Wilkinson. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at ODI, and I'm also Chief Scientific Advisor to the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, CREED. And I've been working in and providing policy advice and support to governments of small island developing states for the last 15 or so years, working on climate resilience, managing disaster risks and sustaining development in the context of climate change. We have a very exciting panel discussion today to reflect on the outcomes of COP26, of which there are many. I guess these outcomes have been interpreted in different ways by researchers, the press, activists, policymakers, and other commentators. And all of that kind of commentary may create some confusion. So I hope we'll get some clarity, but probably also some controversy today on what the negotiated text and the broader outcomes mean for developing countries and for development, so for poverty reduction, for addressing inequality and supporting livelihoods, and particularly thinking about the implications for the livability of cities and coastal areas, islands and other parts of the world, seeing more extreme weather and accelerating environmental degradation and other impacts. But also for developing countries everywhere that have to deliver on their development commitments and address these climate risks, while at the same time stepping up and decarbonising their economies. So we're going to be talking about these kind of intersecting challenges. And we'll have two rounds of interventions from our speakers. The first round will be talking about reflections on COP26 outcomes. And in the second round, we'll be looking ahead to COP27 and changes that need to happen over the next year and beyond. So to initiate the discussion, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Amani Aboud Zeid, to give her opening remarks on where we are as we draw towards the end of this make or break year in the fight against climate change. Amani is the African Union Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy. She's an international development expert and has been serving in Africa in various positions over the last 30 years, including for the African Development Bank, UNDP, and USAID. Amani, what are your reflections on this make or break year? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you for the kind introduction. Maybe you forgot that I'm also a Manchester University graduate. I'm very proud of that, and really happy to join this distinguished panel. And happy with the theme, because it's important that we start working now, reflecting on what happened in COP26 and prepare ourselves right now for the COP27 and beyond. It is obvious that COP26, the summit in Glasgow, has helped to further engage a wide range of stakeholders on the need of urgently cut carbon emissions in the near future, while also creating far-reaching awareness on the devastating impacts of climate change. It is also important to note that the outcomes of COP26 indicate significant milestones and commitments in key areas. First, the commitment by countries to phase out coal consumption and eliminating the subsidies on fossil fuels indicates a renewed vigor to achieve the 1.5 Celsius target at the end of the century. This is a huge outcome, as it's the first time concrete actions on coal and oil consumption are explicitly referenced in the COP outcome document. Second, the COP26 agreement also emphasized the need for countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emissions targets by the end of 2022 to ensure alignment with the temperature goal. In addition, countries are required to strengthen their NDCs as well as long-term strategies to 2050, which will raise ambition and ensure the 1.5 Celsius target is achieved. Another key progress is the commitment by developed countries to increase climate financing for developing countries. Countries agreed to design a new and larger portfolio of climate finance, which will take effect in 2025. We'll see. Developed countries also in principle have agreed to double funding for adaptation by 2025. Despite the significant progress made during the COP26, there still remains huge gaps that could threaten the achievement or the goals that we want to reach. One of the major threats is to global climate ambition is the unwillingness of some major carbon emitters to raise their ambitions. Some of the commitments in the outcome document are also voluntary, suggesting that the actions might not be implemented. Addressing climate change needs to be seen as a global effort, and all parties need to play their role towards a just transition to a low carbon and climate resilient future for all. The issue of climate finance is also still not resolved, which could also pose a threat to the just transition process. Developed countries pledged in 2009 that they would mobilize $100 billion a year for climate finance by 2020. Regretfully, this pledge has not been fulfilled. Despite a renewed ambition to enhance climate finance by 2025, there is no guarantee that developed countries will deliver on this commitment. It is also not clear that what will be new or additional climate finance within this new commitment. For us in Africa, the availability of adequate climate financing will be or is key to transition, or is key for a low carbon and climate resilient development. And I prefer this instead of transition for us in Africa. I prefer climate resilient and sustainable development. And I will explain maybe later on in the Q&A. The continent is currently the most impacted region due to climate change, despite accounting for less than 4% of global emissions. A majority of African countries are currently struggling with limited budgets to address development challenges, not to mention, the immediate challenge that we're having, the one of the COVID and, raising the or availing the finance for vaccination, which we don't have. We still stand at 6% vaccinated people, the least in the least region in the world. So we are limited with limited budgets to address all the development challenges, in addition to rising adaptation costs. You did mention that I'm the commissioner for infrastructure in the African Union. The infrastructure financing needs in Africa could reach $170 billion a year by 2025, with an estimated gap of around $100 billion a year. And by the way, this infrastructure gap includes 600 million people in Africa who do not have access to electricity, and 900 million Africans who do not have access to clean cooking and still rely on kerosene or firewood. The climate change adaptation costs are also expected to steadily increase to 35 billion per year by 2050. Closing the financing gap in Africa requires mobilization of significant financial resources from both domestic and international public and private sources, in addition to the establishment of innovative financing mechanisms that will attract investments. And I'm really happy to see across the continent many efforts in that regard, particularly from the private sector and green bonds being issued, and our private sector, whether it's large or startups, working in green projects. At the African Union Commission, we have already set up various programs and projects to ensure we continue to accelerate towards a resilient, climate resilient, low carbon development in Africa. Our program for infrastructure development, we made sure and we incorporated as an essential criteria for the selection of the regional and transcontinental projects, climate resilience and climate actions. The large renewable energy programs at all levels and smart grids, and whether it's the mini grid, off grid, and large, some of the largest, if not, we have the largest solar power plants in the world are in Africa. Bioenergies, hydropower systems, wind, so on and so forth. We have also our energy transition program, and to identify, the transition pathways to help and support our countries, find, the pathway towards a greener and more climate resilient energy and development. And I can, there's so many other things. And I'm not forgetting, and I'm making sure also that digitalization is very much part of that, as it is a major contributor to also our climate actions in all sectors, particularly in agriculture. Going forward to the post COP26 implementation processes, there is a need to refocus collaborations and partnerships to maximize opportunities in several key areas that include mobilization of adequate climate financing and increasing investments in both mitigation and adaptation efforts, leveraging and creating a conducive environment for accelerated private sector participation in climate agenda. And there was some also positive things happening in COP26, by private alliances in that regard. Continue to raise ambitions of countries and regions towards curbing emissions further as stipulated in the COP26 agreement, accelerating the adoption of platforms, frameworks, and strategies to enhance technology transfer, technical cooperation, and technical capacity building. I would like to maybe not to conclude, but to open that discussion by saying that there are different ways of seeing COP26. It all depends where you are. It depends whether you live on an island state, you live in Africa or in a developing country, you live in a developed country. But one thing is for sure is that we are all in this together, and pledges enough won't do. Concrete actions and implementation that deliver is what is needed now. Really happy and hopeful with the next COP being which is going to take place in Africa. And I do hope also that center stage to that will come the issue of, I know that many try to dodge it or to avoid it, the issue of loss and damage and the compensation for developing countries, particularly for us in Africa, when it comes to climate. There are so many things to be said, but maybe I'll stop here and leave it for my colleagues, the panelists, to take it from there. And also, I'll be staying as much as I can to take maybe one or two questions before I have to phase out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and very much appreciate your words. And thanks for really raising the scale of the challenge for mobilizing finance for climate resilient development in Africa. I think is really one of the critical issues, and we can maybe dig into some of that into a bit more detail as we go through the panel discussion. I want to turn now to our next speaker, is Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, who is Professor of Global Environmental and Climate Governance at the University of Reading. He's a globally recognized leader and a leading scholar on climate governance and international development. And I think, Chuck, you're on the move at the moment, but hopefully you could provide a few words for us on how positive are you feeling about COP26 outcomes? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily. As you said, I'm on the move. Please feel free to disconnect me if my internet is not working. I'll try and be brief for the sake of time and internet. Thanks very much for the invitation, and I think it's a pleasure and honor to share the podium with Amani and other distinguished panelists, including Simon. In my view, one of the sharpest conflicts when it comes to addressing climate change is the tension between climate action and development. And this is why I was keen to be part of this panel. And Simon Maxwell, who will speak perhaps after me, is actually one of the few people that, first of all, brought to the fore this sharp tension or conflict in a sense, but also the possibility of using climate action to ensure a much more sustainable and just development across the world. If you approach COP26 from the prism or the lens of the extent to which this either tension or conflict or the possibility of a synergy between climate and development has been addressed, my view would be that there was a lot of positive noises and steps, but that consistent with the mainstream approaches, this tension has not been resolved, and indeed that COP26 in some ways could be described as a disservice to understanding and addressing this conflict. The problem with climate resilient development, which Amani noted, and that's the term I prefer as well. The challenge is that these are not the things that can be effectively addressed at a COP level. The most fundamental issues that have to be addressed to effectively bring climate action more compatible to development has to happen partly in COP, but partly elsewhere. One of the key goals or objectives of Paris Agreement was to ensure that international finance is flowing in ways that are consistent to low carbon development worldwide or climate resilient development. Currently, vast proportion of global finance remain outside of the climate arena. COP26 tried to sort of bridge this gap, but leaves me worried that there is a sense in which even the attempt to bridge that gap can cause more poverty. If, as Simon Kenny was saying in Mark Kenny rather was saying, we unlock these trillions of dollars from the pension fund and other private equity funds, etc., to help to drive low carbon development. I see a distinctive possibility that the movement of those money will actually deprive Africa of even the traditional ODA, because think what you may about financing, the primary objective of most financiers is still profit. And the macroeconomic structures in poor countries do not still provide the right atmosphere for investing in climate activities. And so there is a distinctive possibility that the money that perhaps would have gone to oil exploration or gas exploration now goes to clean energy, which from a climate perspective is a great news, but now that money is not going to come to Africa. Make no mistake about it. It won't go to Bangladesh. Make no mistake about it. until the issue of de-risking and return on investment is sorted.
Thank you very much. That very sharp intervention, and I hope that the other panelists.
But the
oh, please carry on.
Yeah, the problem. Sorry, I was getting a call. I'm joining from my mother. The problem is that
we may have to move on to the next panelist, and we can come back to Chuck's in a minute when the signal is better.
Of the interruptions, but I can.
We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you in a minute. So let me turn to Simon Maxwell now, and maybe you can reflect or respond to some of the conflict that Chuck has raised there, particularly in terms of where finance goes. Simon Maxwell is an ODI Senior Research Associate and former Director of ODI, and formerly as well the Executive Chair of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, and was also President of the Development Studies Association, so very known to many of you. Simon, how are you feeling about the COP26 outcomes? What are you feeling positive and pessimistic about? Over to you.
I don't know that I can add a great deal to two really good presentations by Amani and Chuks, but let me see what I can do. I've written about my own wrap-up from Glasgow on my website, and the link is there. And I'm going to be inspired in honor of the DSA by Antonio Gramsci, who I'm sure Sam must have been a member of the DSA, if not in my time, then possibly in yours. Look, it's easy to be disappointed about the COP, and many people are disappointed about the COP. So, to quote Gramsci, pessimism of the spirit. You know, emissions are still rising, the NDCs are not good enough, there's not enough finance, loss and damage wasn't properly presented and agreed, the net zero commitments are too vague, and so on and so forth. The key thing to look at is this graph on the right here, which shows what the emissions are currently, what they would be if we'd followed 2010 policies, what they're going to be on 2021 policies, and what the NDCs promise in terms of unconditional and conditional commitments, all of those for 2030, and the pathways for 2 degrees, 1.8 and 1.5 to get to those temperatures on a least cost pathway. And the interesting thing for me in this diagram, and lots of people have different interpretations of it, but is how little the NDCs add compared to where we already are in terms of 2021 policies. And there's just, you know, a very easy calculation, subtract 51.5 from 55, and you get 3.5, and divide that by the gap between 55 and 25, and you've barely covered 10, 12% of what's needed in order to get on the least cost pathway to 1.5 degrees. There is a mountain to climb. We know the climate budget is limited, and the question then is, what are we going to do in order to try and get closer at least to the pathway? And if I then turn to the next slide, because I've only got 4 or 5 minutes, I think the thing is that we should not despair, and following Gramsci, you know, optimism of the will, let's think about the practical things we can do on Monday morning, and we've already heard about some of those. To my mind, Glasgow was not the complete failure that many people would like to argue. It did what it had to do. The UNFCCC process required new commitments to be submitted well in advance of Glasgow. A couple came in very late, some even at Glasgow. But Glasgow was not going to revolutionize commitments because that wasn't the UNFCCC timetable. Now they've asked for new commitments by 2022. I think that's overambitious, that it would be much better to focus on new commitments in 2023, because these are not trivial commitments. These are really difficult plans that countries need to produce. And I see we've already had a question from Anna McCord about social protection. And it's exactly those social costs of transition that need to be very central to the discussion. Now, to pick up on what Chuk said, the model that we've used in CDKN and elsewhere on linking climate and development is this notion of climate compatible development. It's very similar to what Amani called climate resilient development, and Chuk's also. But the key thing about this model is that there are 3 circles and not 2. And we normally only think about mitigation, which is about reducing emissions. Of course, relatively irrelevant for most poor countries who are already very low emitters. I read this week that the average Ethiopian emits the average of 1/5 of a refrigerator. So trivial, amounts of emissions from the poorest countries. And even if they grow, which they need to do, those emissions will be relatively small. And adaptation, which of course links to the loss and damage discussion, but it's absolutely central. But the circle that's always missing from this discussion is how do you position your economy as a developing country in relation to what everybody else is doing? And that is a really important missing element, but is reflected in all the debates we're having about carbon taxes, border carbon adjustments. I think there's a much bigger question about what's going to happen to global trade, to the markets for particular products, and to prices. Some of that can be really negative, but some of it can be, optimistic. You wouldn't want to be an oil producer these days, but you might well want to be a lithium producer. So we need to focus on what does this transition look like? What does global climate compatible development look like in the future? And to skip to the end here, there's a big responsibility for those of us who are researchers. Gramsci talked a lot about the importance of developing a counter-hegemonic narrative because we were trapped inside a particular way of looking at things. I think to follow up on Chuk's, we need to mainstream climate compatible development. We don't need a climate plan, an environment plan, a development plan, a poverty plan, a gender plan. We need one plan for a country, one integrating framework. And of course, we need to engage with some of the big debates that are ongoing in our development studies world on degrowth and environmental policy. And I do hope you've all looked at the debate that I was honored to moderate between Jason Hickel and Stefan Hallegatt, which is in Development Policy Review and free to read. We need a narrative in development studies which is practical, which is positive, which is going to deliver the kind of rapid changes we need, but which is also realistic. And I hope at some point somebody might ask about what is realistic, where is the Overton window, which is the window of what is possible in policy. I'm a little bit impatient myself with people who say we must get to net zero by 2025, which is the Extinction Rebellion narrative, because I just don't think that's feasible. So what is feasible is the question that we need to ask ourselves, which is socially just, inclusive, and delivers all the SDGs and not just climate. Much more to say, but I'll stop there. Emily, thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And I do encourage everybody to put their questions in to the question and answer box. Any response or questions you have to any of the things that you've heard from the panelists so far, there's enough there to provoke response and reaction, I think, already. But let's hear from our final speaker. This from Meena Raman, who is a legal advisor and senior researcher at the Third World Network, and she's also a member of the Board of Friends of the Earth International and honorary secretary to Friends of the Earth Malaysia. Meena, do you agree with Simon? And what's your verdict on the Glasgow Climate Pact and associated negotiations? Over to you.
Well, I agree with Simon in some parts and disagree with him on other parts. And first, allow me to thank the organizers for this. This is a new audience for me, the DSA. So I'm very happy to be here. 4 minutes is a very short time, so I will try to be as fast as possible, like the Japanese bullet train. Just to say that I think for me, it was a very, very difficult COP. It was a very disappointing COP. And I think what is missing, and I just would like to take off, which is where I agree with Simon, the fair shares analysis, the stuff that Jason Hickel and others have put out. And this is something that many of us in the climate justice movement have been talking about in terms of how do you do mitigation in a fair and just way. And I think what COP26 has done is actually to legitimize inequity and it is taking us in the wrong direction. And I'll explain that very fast. We all already know, and I think we know about the 500 gigatons of carbon space left. And we know that this was the latest IPCC report. And we know the relationship between from the historical emissions, the cumulative emissions, and to the present and the future emissions, which is what we all need to be concerned about. But what was very clear for me in Glasgow was the fact that there was a real attempt to dismiss equity, to delete equity, to dilute actually not dilute, they did not want to recognize historical responsibility. I know this for a fact because I worked with some of the developing countries who had put submissions on the table in the Glasgow Pact, which eventually became the Glasgow Pact. There was text there, which was looking at taking from the UNFCCC, the convention, and what it said about historical emissions, from the Cancun decision in 2010 about historical emissions and historical responsibility. None of this made to the Glasgow Pact. And what was very clear for us was that if you looked, for those of us who, I mean, I looked very clear, detailed in terms of the outcome document. If you look at the COP decision, there's no reference to the provisions of the convention. They talk about processes. So provisions are gone. Well, it doesn't mean gone, but we will always fight back, of course. And then if you look at the decision under the CMA of the Paris Agreement, it diluted what was called Article 2.2, which was a huge fight in terms of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, comma, in the light of national circumstances. The comma was gone, and CBDR-RC had to be fought to be reflected in the Glasgow text. This was not a slate of, a typo error. I have done an analysis, it's on the TWN website. I call it a slate of hand. The writing of the Glasgow Pact was very clearly US in the making. It was so clear because what you see now is a reference to calling on all parties, whether it is to phase out unabated coal, or it was now phased down unabated coal and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Big hullabaloo was made about that. The blame fell on China and India, but little is known that actually the G20, which was focusing on coal, did not want to focus, the developed countries did not want to focus on the phase out of all fossil fuels. They went for coal mainly because of the dependence of China and India on this, and that is clear. So it was really set up to be a big game. With all this talk about wanting to limit temperature rise to 1.5, but the pathway to get there was not equitable. It's not just, it's not fair. Just to say that we have 500 gigatons of carbon space left in a 50% probability for limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And we are emitting 42 gigatons every year. And we know this is the critical decade. But how do you do that? Do you do that by net zero by 2050, by Annex 1, by the developed countries? Now, this is where we have a problem. The net zero narrative was already being, unfolded. It unfolded for 2 years. And even before that, Paris Agreement does not talk about a net zero for all parties. It talks about a net zero by mid-century. It doesn't even say net zero, but that's the aim. Global aspiration. But you can't have everyone do a 2050 because you will bust the remaining carbon budget. So without historical responsibility, without taking into account the cumulative emissions, the whole narrative was actually to pin on future emissions. So if this, by all databases, 60% of the current atmospheric space is already used by developed countries. To allow them to continue to use and occupy the remaining carbon space is carbon colonialism. Bolivia, on behalf of the like-minded, called out on that and said, this is carbon colonialism. Second point about the net zero narrative, it's also tied to the carbon markets. It's all about carbon markets with carbon offsets in developing countries through nature-based solutions. So this great escape of the developed world in not acknowledging that they have to get to real zero. I agree with Samuel when he says that the net zero is vague, but if you looked at the details of that, you can't have the developed world go to net zero by 2050. They have to get to real zero. They should have gotten to real zero well before now. And in fact, if you look at the UNFCCC Secretariat reports, between 1994 and 2020, the Annex 1 emissions without the without the economies in transition actually increased. So from 1994, there was no commitment for real rapid reductions on the part of developed countries. So here we are in a climate mess today. And when you do not take into account equity, the responsibility, the historical responsibility of developed countries, what you're doing is you're condemning the rest of the world, particularly in the developing world, as all of us have pointed out, that they will not be able to do the massive scale of transformation without the finance, without the technology transfer. And it's not about carbon border measures. And this is where I will disagree with Simon. Any attempt to bring in environment into the trade, it will always be about, it will be a problem. It will be a barrier for developing countries. So this is not equitous. We do need to talk about what the Green Deal, the new Green Deal is about, if it's really about a new Green Deal. I've seen the UNCTAD reports and they are far better on that. But the final point I will make, because of not enough time and the constraints, the US played a very big damaging role as the biggest bully in town. And I am saying it very forthright because I don't hide and mince my words. It was really horrendous. And so even for the poorest countries, and it's not about compensation. I do not want to use the term compensation for loss and damage. No, we are not talking about compensation because it comes with a lot of political problems. It's about funding for loss and damage, which is really, really necessary. And it's not about ad hoc humanitarian assistance. So I do think that we have a lot to do. We have to reclaim equity. We have to reclaim the notion of what is fair shares. We have to bring back equity to the front and center of ambition. Otherwise, the poor will be the ones who will lose out in the name of climate solutions. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. I hope I have provoked enough attention. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, and that's fantastic. And thanks for your forthright view. On the question of equity and the responsibility of the United States, I think it's really important to name these things. And I want to just pick up on one of the questions that's come in to the question and answer, and then get a sort of round of responses from Sam Hickey, who's asking whether this sort of, particularly the view that you've expressed just now, Meena, doesn't warrant a more radical agenda on degrowth and actually reducing consumption levels. If you could respond on that, and then Simon and Amani as well, and then Simon, maybe you can also pick up on some of Meena's comments in response to your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, on this issue of degrowth, of course, it has a northern context. I can't say degrowth in the developing world, but the people are poor, where you don't have any food to eat, or you're hunger, or you don't have anything. You can't say degrowth that, because then you condemn them to poverty. So the degrowth agenda is really much about the elite consumption. And I think this is not new. We've already talked about it since 1992 at the Rio Summit, the changing of production systems. And we talked about consumption patterns, which need to be radically altered in a way that ensure that we all live simply so that others can simply live. That still pertains today. But that notion of degrowth in the North particularly, and in the elite of the South, that doesn't play up. That's why we have a lot of techno fixes. What was horrifying is the talk of electric vehicles, private cars with electric. I mean, come on, we don't even have public transport in many parts of our world, let alone talking about electric cars. This is disgusting. Yeah, so I do think that the morality of the issue is that we do need to take equity front and center, and we do need to talk about degrowth in the North and degrowth in the elite of the South as well. There's a lot of global elite in the South who are following and aping the same model of development, which cannot be sustainable. So of course we have to fight at all fronts.
Thanks. Simon, maybe you can reflect on that question, given the conversation that you also, the discussion that you facilitated. Oh, and you're on mute.
Anybody interested in this topic should really read the debate between Jason and Stefan, because they took 10, 15,000 words to deal with all the issues. What is completely clear, and Meena is right, consumption has to fall globally, and consumption amongst the richest has to fall faster than elsewhere, and indeed the poorest need to increase their consumption in order to reach a minimum standard of living. The top 10% of the world's population account for 48% of carbon emissions. And of course, the top 10% is not just Jeff Bezos and co. The cutoff for the top 10% in income is $38,000 US, which is a not unachievable middle-class income in many OECD countries, and probably some people on this call have incomes of $38,000 and are in the top 10%. So the finger is pointing very much at us. Now, degrowth in its purest form, which is the Jason, Hickel and others form, requires a complete restructuring of the economy. I mean, he frames it very much as an issue of surplus extraction by capitalist economies, both domestically and internationally. The point that Stefan makes in response is there's a great deal we can do with environmental policy right now, this minute. He says, and this is also interesting, that richer countries tend to look after their environment better than poorer ones because they have more spare capacity to do so. And if you want governments to intervene radically on the environment, well, they need the revenue in order to do that. And one of the ways you have more revenue is by being a richer country. So he says, and I'm sympathetic to this really, let's at least start with all the environmental policies that we have. And there's there's this kind of the new economy movement has such a long list of demands, starting with universal basic income and many other things, that I think it's not deliverable in the time scale we need in order to achieve climate action. Meena is angry, and I completely understand why she's angry, and I'm angry. We're all angry about the failure of countries to start earlier and deliver more on climate change. If we'd started reducing in 2010, we could have got away with 2% a year. Now we need a reduction of 7% a year in order to get back on the least cost pathway. I find inexplicable that the whole UNFCCC process focuses so much on territorial emissions, which are those emissions which come from a country, and not on consumption emissions. So that all these issues about coal, first of all, hide the fact that rich countries are actually consuming more coal than many poor countries, but also hide the fact that some of the coal consumption in poor countries is producing goods which are being consumed in rich countries. So let's focus in the future on what this global Green New Deal looks like. And just one sentence on that, Emily, which is that people use the term Green New Deal in very different ways. And I've said that I think it's a bit like virtue signaling. I'm a good guy, I believe in the global Green New Deal. We need to be really careful about what exactly is in that. And that's where the work needs to be done. It needs to be inclusive and socially just and deal with the transition costs and so on. But if you look at some versions of this global Green New Deal, it involves mass nationalization, for example. Is that a necessary requirement or a desirable requirement or not a requirement at all, is the kind of issue where we need to be debating. So Meena, let's work together with Amani and Chuks and all the others on developing what looks like a really practical, deliverable, ambitious and just Green New Deal for the future. That's a project for the DSA and all its counterparts around the world, and for think tanks like ODI, Emily, and all their counterparts around the world too. Excuse me.
Thanks, Simon. Amani, do you want to come back on that point?
Yes, well, maybe I will tackle many of the questions at the same time, because I see many of them also reference Africa. But let me just say that Meena is angry, and we are all angry, and I do support many of the things that she said and that were said by Simon. But my concern, or the main reason really for which I am also angry, and as an African here, as a citizen of a developing country, is that the climate agenda is turning into a carrot and stick agenda to developing countries. It is very serious. It is very serious, and I do have, you know, specific and concrete examples. You don't do this, then we don't fund you. And the sanctions, and I'm calling them sanctions, started to hit already. And I did mention, I did emphasize the energy sector in my intervention, because we are seeing sanctions now being applied. We do and still advocate for instance, for natural gas being the cleanest of fossil for gas to power and for clean cooking. So when you say, oh, I'm stopping any investment that or any support financing of gas projects, that means practically means that people should continue to live on firewood. Or someone, and I did face, by the way, I face these challenges almost every day. From or some developing countries who are insisting zero emitting cars and electrical cars should be on the agenda for Africa. Honestly, how would anybody think that I can go to our heads and of states and governments and say, or to our people, that people who do not have an electric bulb in the room, and then start talking about electric cars? It seems that they are completely, it's almost like a parallel universe. And it's not about even the South elite. I mean, who can afford now an electric car? And where is this electric cars? And the batteries even for? So there are so many technological and technical issues and affordability issues and availability issues. We are starting to tackle the issue of used cars and cars that are being sent to us, exported to us. Polluting cars and substandard cars are the ones being exported to our continent, and we are fighting that. So there's so many things that we sit on that front. But I want to emphasize on a positive note. Again, speaking particularly and specifically about Africa, there is the hope and the optimism comes from a different angle. And this is where I insisted that our agenda and our priority is development and not transition. Because ideally, transition from what? From poverty or from firewood? So our agenda is development. And many of our economies and most of our economies are still growing. Cities are still start being built. Many of the infrastructure start being built. For us, renewables and green represent an opportunity because they are readily available in the continent. What is not available maybe is the know-how or the expertise, and this is where we are calling for support. So renewables are available in abundance on the continent, and we are using them out of necessity to bridge a gap, not to transit. I mean, others may use them for transit, and I hope they start doing that, because they're not walking the talk. They just, give us the lovely speeches and sanction. So, so we are doing that massively, and we are going to use everything that is available, and particularly renewables, because also the cost effectiveness of renewables now. It was not possible before. Now they are becoming, more competitive in price. Okay, so we are not. I'm sorry to say, we are not dumb. We do understand also economics. So when something is getting cheaper, we're going to use it, not because we are told to use it or because we have to transit, but because it is a survival. It is the matter of survival for us and for growth. And we have the right to grow as well and the right to develop. So I'm here wearing, my hat as a citizen and not an official hat, but to understand that climate and I did mention about the private sector, climate or green, forget the word climate, green development is or allows fantastic opportunities for the private sector. And I was amazed really and continue to be amazed by our young people who are doing fantastic job either in energy sector, on the cooling front, on green enterprises, but also by our private sector. There is growingly these green bonds that are being emitted on the continent by African private sector, and they're seeing it as a profitable business. So that's good. So what I am against is really the sanctions and shifting the debate to make it only the responsibility of developing countries and or Africa, and starting making choices for us. This is where I come really very, very angry. We are also, we know what we want, we have priorities, and our agenda has to be Africa-led, but not dictated. And this is only where we can all, develop. And I'm calling, and I hope that everyone will assume the responsibilities. I mean, and start delivering on the promises, because I mean, it is good to have them in the text as pledges, but it took 10 years or 12 years to have the 100 billion, written in the text. Let's not hope, or let's not wait another 20 years to have them delivered, just as an example. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, no, really important point there about making sure that finance, kind of climate compatible finance is also kind of pro-developmental and in support of development priorities, but also, I mean, making sure that additional climate finance is additional as well, and not diverting development finance into kind of climate projects. I want to pick up on one of the other questions, which was about youth and students and activism, and how to give more emphasis to that, or what more should we be doing to support young people, and how, I guess, the kind of broader question of how important is this involvement and activism in the climate agenda. It gets picked up on a lot in the press. Is this really critical to progress on climate change, and how influential do you think it has been so far in at COP26 and in the climate negotiations? Any thoughts on that? Perhaps
maybe maybe I'll go for this, because I mean, we work with youth quite a bit, and I do think they're very critical. Their voice is important. I think world over, well, Greta Thunberg, people love her, people hate her, but I must say that she has inspired a lot of young people, even in our part of the world, in the developing world. And I think their voices are important. Many of us work with them to bring in the equity dimension of the issue, and we also work with them on the kind of solutions that are needed. And I think, well, for the North, I think she has really shaken the government. I mean, the youth movement in the North is really, really key. For the longest time, I mean, I'm old now, but for many, many years ago, I was a young activist itself. And I honestly felt that the biggest change in the world can only come when you have massive transformation in the US and a lot of transformation coming from Europe and the other parts of the developed world, where you talk about the real kinds of systemic changes and inequality and inequity and all that we talk about. So yes, that movement is key, and I think that we need to work with them. And of course, there are many ways of connecting the global North and the global South activists together, and that's what we try to do, but not enough, but we need to do more. So I do think that we need to engage. And I think for education, I mean, I know that a lot of students refer to stuff that Third World Network produces, and I think more and more we need to do that. And the DSA, I'm sure, has a huge responsibility, churning out very active intelligent, smart climate activists who want to change the world.
Fantastic, thank you. Simon?
Personally, I'm all in favor of senior activism. I think those of us who are not quite as youthful as we used to be also have an important role to play. Look, there's a couple of things about this. When I was at ODI, we used to say that change happened when three things came together. And this was referring back to things like ending poverty, the great 2005 moment in international development. The first thing is you need leadership. There has to be a commitment from the top, not always visible on climate change. The second is there has to be popular support and a popular movement. And then the third, and this is where researchers come in, is the power of a good idea. And when those three things come together, as they kind of did in 2005, and around the MDGs and the SDGs, I think it was a pretty unstoppable movement. But it's also not entirely unproblematic, I think, and there are some particular challenges for researchers. I talked earlier on about the Overton window and how what activists try to do is to shift the Overton window or broaden it so that more radical policies become possible. And if you ever question that, what you're told is, well, if we reach for the stars, we might manage to capture the sky. And I'd be interested to see what others think about that, because it always seems to me slightly difficult to argue for what is clearly impossible, like net zero in 2025. And I know perhaps I belong to a world in which we look in more detail at policies and try to plot practical routes forward. So that interface between activism and very ambitious activism and the reality of practical politics is, I think, where the rubber hits the road. And then there's finally a particular challenge for think tanks. If anybody here is interested in think tanks, I recommend the website of On Think Tanks, and they run training for young think tank leaders. And I'm doing a session for them in their annual training course next January, I think, on the activist think tank. And it starts off in a little bit the way that Meena does, by saying that everybody has a picture of Greta Thunberg, you know, on the wall in their cubicle or on their desk. When I was at ODI, we always banned the use of the word advocacy because we didn't want to be captured or seen as being party pre by any political party. We regarded ourselves as the champion of ideas, and we were very careful to try and make an argument in a neutral way, but lead people gently towards the conclusion that we always believed in. Maybe that's a very old-fashioned view. Maybe think tanks, and there are some think tanks that are absolutely out there in front, arguing a case and taking positions. And the training I'm running in January is about what are the risks for think tanks when you do that, as well as the opportunities. You know, you might get funding from one group, but then you might find the door to the government office is shut in your face, or that other donors are turning their backs on you. So how do research institutes and think tanks plot a route through the really often difficult politics of action on climate change? I'd love to hear what others think about that. I mean, maybe Amani and Meena and others have a view.
Thanks. Yeah, I encourage people to look at that course if they're interested. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in the discussions around loss and damage, this comes up a lot. You know, how radical a view do you want to take in the negotiations, and certainly the language of compensation has been kept out of the discussions. Or that's what I observed from COP26 negotiations. Even those who favour it were not using that term rather purposefully. So it's an interesting discussion. Certainly, I want to just cover one more question before we move on.
Emily, if I may, please
sure,
go back to the point regarding yes. And while I agree with Simon and with Meena, I would also like us to. Okay, I don't have the word in English. In French, they say relativiser, make things relative. The activism that we have been seeing through a young Swedish also benefited largely from social media. I would like us also to remember that not for us, for instance, in Africa, we're not all connected. We don't have the same platforms. We don't have always, our voices are not always seen. And it's the way, you know, the magnification of these, of some of the advocacy has did not show, or may not, or risk not showing also other important, viable voices from our continent, even though we do have some young people who tried and made their voices heard. But I would like us also to take that into account. It's not because there is one or more people who are talking about it that this is it. There are also others, except that they are handicapped by the means and or the technology to carry their voices forward. This is the first point. The second point regarding youth, and particularly African youth, and I did allude to that in my introductory remarks. Maybe, and that's a personal opinion, does not reflect my organization, because I'm also my first training was being an engineer. I also believe in things that happen and concrete steps, and it is fantastic to see what our young people are doing in that doing. So that's also advocacy or activism, whatever the term, that by demonstration, by doing, and not by taking into world stage and start, you know, making speeches. So I also believe in doing, because what is lacking for us is, and okay, so that's all very good, how to do it. And these young people are doing it. I mean, I had a panel in COP26, a young Egyptian who has established a company, an entrepreneur with another 15 women. There are 15 women, and they are tackling the issue of cooling in Egyptian villages, which is a major issue. Going forward, the issue of cooling is very high, you know, in terms of problems, climate-induced problems. Who heard about that? Who heard about her? Who would hear about her? Because the stage is not given or not necessarily ready to also accommodate other visions, other faces coming from different environments, or coming from places or countries that we do not like. Did we see a Chinese advocate there, or would we allow a Chinese advocate there? So even in that activism or advocacy space, believe you me, there are lots of politics involved. And unfortunately, this is also where we don't always see the fantastic things happening in many developing countries. So please, next time when you are about to put a picture on your wall, make sure that's also an inclusive picture, not just one. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I appreciate the examples, and there were certainly a lot of other voices at COP, you know, outside the negotiations and outside the main kind of plenary sessions, and in the pavilion area and in the blue zone, and with plenty of really excellent examples of doing, and more than just blah, blah, blah. So I think we need to kind of appreciate those. And I want to cover just one more question before we move on to the second section and talk about kind of next steps. Was the first question from Anna McCord about kind of major reform in social protection programs as a potential response to the climate extremes, climate-induced dislocation and poverty that we are going to see, regardless of, you know, how, if countries are able to step up their commitments and also achieve them. Is that the major reform that we need to see globally, to have mass scale social protection programs? Good to get your thoughts on that as a kind of a key policy response. Simon.
Who would dare disagree with Anna McCord? Of course, but the reason why I'm so unhappy with many of the conditional NDCs that countries have submitted to the UNFCCC is that they don't deal properly with the question of transition and with the social costs, as well as, you know, renewable energy rollout and better planning in urban areas and so on. We had a chapter on some of this in the UN Environment Emissions Gap Report, I think 2 years ago. In India, the largest source of revenue for Indian railways is coal. And that revenue cross-subsidizes cheap fares for passengers in India. So you take away coal and you're immediately left with a huge problem for connectivity and for Indian railways in particular. There are, I think, 4 states in India where coal royalties are the biggest single source of revenue. And if you take that away, there'd be a financial crisis in those states. Now, of course, that's not to say that coal therefore should continue ad infinitum, but it is to say that if you're going to destroy the livelihoods of coal miners and undermine the fiscal base of a number of key activities in the country, then you need to have a plan to deal with it. And you can call that social protection or call it some kind of transition fund. Germany has a transition fund for the coal communities in former Eastern Germany of something like 45 billion euros. We know from the UK what happens if you don't think properly about transition. And when we closed the coal mines under Mrs. Thatcher in the 1980s at very short notice, it caused a huge amount of hardship. So my pitch has always been that what countries which have very difficult transition problems need to do is to frame them properly, present them in a conditional NDC, and then challenge the richer countries to provide the financial technical support that they need. All those things that Amani talked about as being part of the discussion, especially in the next COP. You know, we don't achieve zero carbon if we don't walk hand in hand, and we can't leave people on the scrap heap as so many countries have had to do when they've made these sudden transitions in the past.
Thanks, Simon. Meena, did you want to comment on that?
I agree with Sam that Simon, that we do need to do a lot of work on the NDCs actually. The problem is that many of the developing countries, and I think, Emily, you might also know that, it's a huge challenge actually in terms of determining their own needs. And I think this is where, when we talk about the new collective goal on finance, which is actually one of the important next steps, that's very critical for post-2020, post-2025, to implement NDCs. And we already know that the current NDCs require 500 billion in terms of international resources, and we are nowhere near that scale. But for new NDCs, and if we want to ramp it up, we have to do it in a way that is much more detailed in terms of the needs. And I think many countries in the developing world are actually incapacitated to do that. How exactly do you quantify the needs, and how do you look at the trends, and it's really quite difficult. So I do think that the academia can help a lot in this area. How can we assist in terms of putting some of these things in terms of what an NDC can contain, ideas and proposals in that direction, so that developing countries can actually have some help. So I do think that we need to increase capacity on that front. The capacity which is now being stressed a lot is on the reporting capacity, on the transparency side. It's not in terms of the kind of ideas that you know, and the needs determination and the kind of pathways that we need to go. I think it's a lot more work that need to be done. And I understand, and I'm sorry to say this, but in the first NDCs that some countries had to do, they were actually roping in foreign consultants to do this, and foreign consultants who had no knowledge about the local conditions. And so there's no point having some, you know, funder give money to foreign consultants to come and do your NDC. You don't build capacity, you don't build you know, the local conditions into it. And that's the same for the Green Climate Fund. A lot of that proposals that go for funding under the Green Climate Fund are done by international entities and consultants. It's become a huge business. Next, the carbon markets will be a huge business for consultants. So it's a consultancy-run world in the climate arena. And I do think that we really need to pay attention with good academics as assisting and think tanks in that sense. They do have a role in terms of actually coming up with some frameworks and what does it look like, you know, some method, whatever, you know this very well, Emily, because ODI does a lot of assessments in terms of finance as well, the different kind of methodologies and so on.
And if I could just put you on the spot, do you think that would be the point about social protection would be a good use of a loss and damage facility fund, additional finance for loss and damage, if that could be agreed at the next COP?
You're asking me that question? I'm not really sure. I think we need to understand what that will entail, because the loss and damage conversation at the moment, as I see, is that it's not going to be so easy. As you know, it's a dialogue now. Whether we will get there is not sure. But I do think that we need to look at what the Santiago framework and all the elements there in terms of how will it, not financing the Santiago framework, but what exactly are the needs. So social protection is one of them, but what else? I do think that we need to look at the whole gamut and scope of what loss and damage entails really in terms of the needs. Like in a lot of countries, I mean, this is where there's a fine line between adaptation and loss and damage. Even early warning systems are not there. Basic things like that, so there are many aspects. And I think we can come up with a big, broad scope of what it can cover, including social protection.
Thanks. Simon, did you want to say something on that? And then also comment on what you think needs to happen next and look into COP27. Oh, you're on mute.
We had a discussion at the beginning of CDKN about loss and damage, and it was so politically sensitive that we hardly dared to have it, and things have changed a lot, largely I think due to the constant activism by Salim al-Hook, who is a good friend and has been absolutely responsible for bringing this to the public debate, and it shows what an engaged academic can do in terms of changing the world. But I agree with Meena that loss and damage covers a number of things, including, for example, rebuilding roads, ports. If you think about Dominica, Emily, you might want to share some of your experience. Look at the impact of the hurricane. It was social protection, but it was also many other things. But the point I wanted to contribute on this is that climate finance is a complete mess, in my view. There are now, according to the bank, something like 560 different entities in the world providing ODA to countries. And many of the new ones that have been created are in the climate space. So we end up with large numbers of rather poorly funded funds with different procedures and overlapping mandates. And as I think Amani said earlier on, there is a huge ambiguity about whether public funds and private funds interact, overlap, and whether we actually need public funds for many of the things that are going to be built in developing countries, and whether or not we need to restrict the role of public funds, particularly to global public goods, for example, or to innovation and infant industries. There's a debate to be had, first of all, about what public money is needed for and how it relates to private money, and secondly, how it's organized. I've always been in favor of smaller, fewer, better organized funding windows that are properly governed. So not all necessarily the World Bank and the IMF, but some of them within the UN, but we are overloaded. And that's one of the things that we should look at in the next COP. To answer your other question, we need to go forward. I think the next COP should not be asking for new NDCs. I think to ask for a whole raft of new NDCs in the space of 12 months is unrealistic and unhelpful. The next round was supposed to be in 2025, taking the commitments out to 2035. We need to focus on that date and then bring the date to delivery back to, say, 2023. and support countries in doing that in some of the ways that Amani talked about, with extra finance, with technology, with institution building, so that countries really take possession, you know, even with a bit of help, Meena, from consultants at places like ODI.
Thanks very much, Simon. Over to you, Meena. What do you think the priorities are over the next year? Most of us don't pay much attention to what happens between COPs, but you know, what do we need to be thinking about? What will you be working on or looking at over the next year under the UK presidency and beyond?
Well, the Egyptian presidency is what we are looking forward to. And I think certainly adaptation would be high priority, particularly for the global goal on adaptation and the elaboration of the global goal. This was one of the most difficult outcomes of Glasgow. There was a lot of resistance in even talking about the global goal on adaptation, because as you know, the developed countries said Paris Agreement already has that. So why do you want to look into metrics and whatever and other things? And I think the Africa group in particular and the G77 after that has taken on the global goal on adaptation, which is really important. Particularly, I think with the IPCC report, which is coming out in February, it is going to be very clear that we are already crossing a lot of tipping points, which are very difficult in terms of, so adaptation and loss and damage will really be increasingly important. So that's critical. The Sharm el-Sheikh program, which is what they've called the global goal on adaptation, which is really important. And then, of course, there is an invitation actually to on climate finance, the new collective goal on climate finance. There are some submissions that is being invited to observers and others to give some inputs into the needs of developing countries. So I think there are opportunities for the academic world to also contribute to some of that thinking. There's a lot of opportunities for providing submissions in some of these areas. So I do think that we should, I mean, well, TWN is preparing at the moment all the various tasks that need to be done, and then we can share with you if you want. And so people can make submissions, because some of these are picked up. They are picked up by the governments, they're picked up by others. So that's very important in terms of the finance forward. And then, of course, this big fight over the definition of climate finance, because that's the most difficult, because climate finance for the longest battle was, it's not ODI as we, ODA as we know. It's about new, additional, predictable, and that's always been resisted. So all the different methodologies and all that are being discussed right now, and the final compromise was actually climate finance definitions. So that's a very important area as well. What does that mean? What does it look like? So, we can also put in submissions and start thinking of some of these things. So there's a lot of work to do, but for me, I think the most critical piece is actually the issue about bringing fair shares, equity, very much back into the center of it. And I agree with Simon that you can't expect the revisit of NDCs just like that. Already the EU and the US have said we are not going to revisit our NDCs. So who are they asking to ramp up their NDCs, especially when there's no discussion on the climate finance end? So I do think that that it's really unrealistic for what Glasgow had done on that front. But certainly there is a global stocktake in 2023. I think, I don't know how many of you have been following that process. That's the final point I will make. The global stocktake is actually a stocktake in 2023 of all the goals of the Paris Agreement, not just the temperature goal, but also the adaptation goal, the finance goal, the technology transfer goal. And one of the biggest issues is what inputs do parties can rely on. There's a lot on the science side, but that's not enough on equity and the social dimension, the development dimension, all the things that we have been talking about on this call. A lot of literature and can be made available in terms of being resources for countries to actually use it. And developing countries have been stressing that we need much more resources on and inputs, think pieces and academic articles and inputs coming from the various social dimension of the problem. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here if the DSA wants to take this on in a big way. Many opportunities for very good academics to provide inputs and submissions into the process, which can be picked up by governments.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, you've picked up there on a number of the ways in which academics, researchers can engage over the coming year and beyond, and really help to untangle and address some of the issues that we've been discussing over the last hour and a half. We're coming to an end now, and I want to thank very much all of the speakers for your insights and critical views on COP26 outcomes and everything that's not in the outcome of COP26. I think Amani has had to leave a little earlier. It was obviously great to have her opening remarks. There's a lot more we can do as a research community on data and evidence, thinking about roles and activism in some of the definitions that Meena was talking about around climate finance, looking critically at commitments and equity issues, and producing the sort of articles, think pieces, and other publications which can help in drawing out the various dimensions of this incredibly complex challenge. So I won't try and summarize any more than that, all of the great contributions, but I think we will have a few final words from Sam Hickey, who's going to talk about the next DSA webinar. But thanks so much to everybody for participating in this discussion. That's all from me.
Great, many thanks, Emily. And just to second the round of thanks for all the contributors to the panel today. That was superb. Really clear, punchy, and highly expert opinions on the subject, and brilliantly chaired. Thanks, Emily, for that. We'll be sharing the full recording and some highlights very widely after this to make sure that our crowded world of webinars doesn't overtake us fully, and we get these messages out there. And I've noted all the several challenges to the DSA to work more actively on these issues. Just to flag briefly another date for your diaries, on the 12th of January, as will be advertised next week, our next webinar will deal with the FCDO, UK's not so newly merged Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and to review that we have Stefan Durkon, ex-chief economist at DFID and current advisor to the current Foreign Secretary, along to have a look at this. One issue we might want to explore there is something which maybe other people spotted early on, is that perhaps that integration of foreign policy issues with development issues is actually quite beneficial when we come to think about the climate emergency. In a way that the need for integration there. But let's see if that comes up there. So that will be advertised shortly. And just many thanks again to all our participants, and particularly our panelists, for such an engaging set of presentation. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thanks a lot.